In the long, hot summer of 1665, when the city of London was dying at a rate of 7,000 souls a week, and the bells of every parish church were ringing so continuously through the long nights that the bell ringers had begun to take their meals in shifts. There was a plague doctor working the narrow lanes of the parish of St. Giles in the fields whose name was Dr. Aldous Finch, and who, on the 18th night of his rounds, was called to a sealed house on Three Crow Lane to attend to a single patient, and who found at the bedside of that patient a thing that was not, by any account he had ever heard, supposed to be in the city of London in the year of our Lord, 1665. He had been a plague doctor for 19 days at that point. Before the plague, Dr. Finch had been a physician of modest reputation and modest income, with a small practice in Holborn and a wife and 2 daughters, and an apprentice boy named Thomas, who had run the household errands and ground the powders for his medicines. The wife and daughters had been sent into Hertfordshire in the first week of June, when the bills of mortality from the western parishes had begun to climb past the line that everyone with the means to leave had been waiting for. The apprentice had been sent with them, because the boy's mother had begged Dr. Finch on her knees in the kitchen to spare him, and Dr. Finch was not a man who could refuse such a request. He had remained in the house alone, with his cat and his books, and the small black bag of instruments that his father had given him on the day he had completed his medical training at the University of Padua some 23 years before. He had made his rounds, in the ordinary way, for the first 10 days of June. By the middle of the month, the parish was dying so quickly that the College of Physicians had begun appointing emergency plague doctors from among the regular physicians, paying them out of the parish funds at a rate of £2 per week, with the understanding that they would attend the houses of the infected, would write the diagnosis on the cards that the parish clerks would nail to the doors, and would do whatever could be done for the dying, which on most days was very little. Dr. Finch had accepted the appointment on the 2nd of July. He had been given the long, oiled leather coat and the wide-brimmed black hat, and the famous mask of the plague doctor, with its long hooked beak stuffed with a mixture of dried herbs and cartons soaked in vinegar, that was meant to filter the bad air of the sick-room and to protect the wearer from the contagion. He had also been given a wooden staff, of the length of a long walking stick, with a small iron crown at one end. The staff was used to examine patients without touching them, and to tap on the doors of houses that had not yet been opened to him, and occasionally, when the dying became violent in their fevers, to keep them at a distance. He had not, in his 19 days of work, used the staff for the 3rd purpose. He had used it for the 2nd purpose many times, however, on the doors of houses where the families had already been carted away to the pest pits, but where the parish clerks had not yet returned to remove the red cross painted on the door, and where Dr. Finch was therefore expected to confirm, by knocking, that the house was indeed empty before the parish would mark it as cleared. The knocking was the worst part of his work. It was worse, he had discovered, than the dying themselves. The dying he could attend to. He could give them poppy syrup and wormwood tincture, and he could lance the buboes when the buboes were ready to be lanced, and he could pray with them when they wanted prayer, and he could sit with them in their last hours when they did not. There was a craft to dying, when one had the right physician beside one, and Dr. Finch had been raised in that craft and was reasonably skilled in it. The craft had not been designed for the present circumstances. It had been designed for individual deaths in private houses, with families gathered around the bed and a parish priest waiting in the parlour. It worked badly when applied to whole streets at once. But Dr. Finch had been a careful student of his profession, and he applied what he could of the craft to each patient he attended, and he believed that this was what his work was for, and the work itself did not frighten him. The knocking did frighten him. He would arrive at a house where the cross had been painted on the door, and he would tap the iron crown of his staff against the wood, and he would call out his name and his business, and he would wait, and most often the answer would come from inside, the weak voice of a survivor calling him in, or the crying of a child, or the moan of a fevered patient. But sometimes there would be no answer at all. And then he would knock again, more firmly, and listen for any movement, any small sound that might indicate a living person inside who was simply too weak to call out. And if there was no sound, he would push the door open with the iron crown of his staff, and he would step inside, and he would find what was usually inside such houses by the third or fourth day after the cross had been painted, which was the silence of a family that had finished its dying together, and the smell, and the flies, and the things in the beds that were no longer people, but were still wearing the clothes of people who had been alive a few days before. He did not knock at sealed houses any more than he could help. He preferred the houses where someone was still calling. On the 18th night of his work, which was a Tuesday in the third week of July, Dr. Finch was walking back to his lodgings in Holborn when he was stopped at the corner of St. Giles High Street by a woman in a grey shawl who had been waiting. It appeared, for some considerable time, in the small rain that had begun to fall after sundown. The woman did not approach him directly. She stood in the recess of a shuttered, sharp doorway, with her shawl pulled up over her hair, and she called his name across the wet cobbles in the careful, low voice of a person who did not wish to attract the attention of the watchmen who were patrolling the lane. "Dr. Finch," she said. "Dr. Finch, if you please." Dr. Finch crossed the lane to the sharp doorway, with the rain pattering on the wide brim of his hat and the long beak of the mask, and he stopped a careful 4 paces from the woman in the shawl, and he raised the iron crown of his staff in the formal greeting of his office, and he asked her, through the mask, what her business was with him at this hour. The woman did not move closer. She had the sense, which not all of the citizens of St. Giles had developed in those weeks, to keep her distance from a plague doctor who had been at his rounds all evening. She spoke from the recess of the doorway in the same low, careful voice. "There is a house on 3 Crow Lane," she said. "A patient is in need of attendance. The watchmen have not yet been informed. The cross has not yet been painted. The household has the means to pay you privately for the discretion as much as the physic. They ask whether you will come." Dr. Finch considered the woman in the shawl. He could not see her face very clearly in the rain and the shadow of the doorway, but her voice was steady, and her grammar was the grammar of a person who had been taught to speak well, and the cloak beneath her shawl, when the small lantern of a passing watchman briefly lit the recess, appeared to be of a quality that did not belong on a kitchen maid or a parish woman. She was a servant, Dr. Finch judged, of a household above the ordinary rank, the kind of household that paid for discretion when it had reason to. He considered, also, the proper response of a parish-appointed plague doctor to the offer of private payment for a private call. The College of Physicians had been very clear on this question. Plague doctors in parish service were expected to attend public cases first, in the order in which the cases were registered with the parish clerk, and were not to undertake private work that might delay the public rounds. He had also been a physician for 23 years, and he understood, as the College of Physicians sometimes did not, what was actually being asked of him in such a recess on such a rainy night by a servant of such a household. A patient in need of attendance, on whose door the cross had not yet been painted, in a house that had not yet been registered with the parish, in a household with the means to pay for discretion. There was only one kind of patient who fitted that description in St. Giles in the third week of July of 1665. The household had a person inside who was showing the early signs of the plague, and who the household did not wish the parish to know about, because once the parish knew, the cross would be painted on the door, and the door would be locked from the outside by the watchman, and every person inside the house would be sealed in for 40 days with the patient, and most of them, by the running probabilities of the time, would not come out again. The household was offering Dr. Finch private payment to attend the patient quietly, before the parish was informed, in the hope that the patient might recover, or might at least die quickly, before any official record had been made of the illness, and before the doors had been locked. It was an offer that was being made in many houses in London in those weeks, by many households, to many physicians. It was, strictly speaking, a request to commit a small treason against the parish, and against the city, and against the public health of the realm. Dr. Finch had been declining such offers for 19 days. He stood in the rain, 4 paces from the woman in the doorway, and he considered the offer from the household on 3 Crow Lane. He thought about the small chest of coin in the drawer of his writing desk at Holborn, which had once contained £19 and now contained 3. He thought about the wife and daughters in Hertfordshire who would need to eat in September, and again in October, and again every month after that, regardless of whether or not the plague had ended in London. He thought about the apprentice boy Thomas's mother, who was a widow with 4 other children, and who had been sending Dr. Finch letters from Hertfordshire to ask whether the boy might be permitted to take on additional work, because the household was struggling. He thought about the parish funds, which paid him £2 per week, and from which he was expected to feed himself and to keep a roof over his lodgings and to set aside something for his family, and which by the end of any given week were almost entirely gone. Then he thought about the cross on the door and the watchmen with their long pikes and the families locked in for 40 days. He had seen in his 19 days what happened in the houses where the families were locked in. "What is the address?" he said. 3 Crow Lane, the woman said. "The house with the green door, number 9. The patient is in the upper bedchamber. The household has been told to expect you within the hour. What is the patient's condition?" "Fever," the woman said. "Some delirium. There is a swelling under the left arm that the housekeeper noticed at supper. The patient has not yet eaten today." "How old is the patient?" The woman in the shawl paused. The rain was falling more heavily now, and the lanterns of the watchmen had moved on down the lane, and the recess of the doorway was very dark. 11, she said. "The patient is 11 years old. She is the youngest daughter of the house. Her name is Rosamond. The household is asking Dr. Finch whether you will please come." Dr. Finch closed his eyes behind the mask. He had, he reminded himself, 2 daughters of his own, who were 11 and 13 years old respectively, and who were at this moment safe in Hertfordshire, and who would not be safe if he did not continue to send them money every month. He reminded himself that he was a plague doctor in the parish service, and that the College of Physicians had been clear about the prohibition on private calls. He reminded himself that he had refused such offers 19 times already, on the perfectly sound reasoning that to make exceptions for the wealthy was to participate in the slow corruption of the public health of the city, and that the corruption killed more people in the long run than any individual exception saved. Then he opened his eyes, and he nodded once, very slightly, beneath the wide brim of the hat. "Tell the household," he said, "that I will come within the hour." The woman in the shawl bowed her head, in a small motion that was somewhere between courtesy and gratitude, and she stepped out of the recess of the doorway and slipped away along the wet lane in the direction of 3 Crow Lane, without another word, and Dr. Finch stood in the rain for a long moment after she had gone, with the rain pattering on the wide brim of his hat and the long beak of the mask, and he tried to think about what kind of man he had just become, and what kind of physician, and what he would say to himself in the morning, and what he would say to his wife when she came home from Hertfordshire and asked him about his 19th night of work. He could not think of anything to say. He turned, and he began to walk in the direction of 3 Crow Lane. 3 Crow Lane was a narrow lane of tall, narrow houses, of the sort that had been built in London in the years after the late King's Restoration, with timbered upper stories that leaned outward over the cobbles until the eaves of the houses on opposite sides of the lane very nearly touched. It was a respectable address. The households on 3 Crow Lane were the households of merchants and lawyers, and 1 or 2 minor officials of the East India Company, and the doors of the houses were painted in the colours that those families had chosen for themselves, blue and green and dark red, in the small ostentation that respectable households used to distinguish themselves from the merely respectable households 1 street further from the better parts of the parish. The house with the green door was the 3rd from the corner. There was no cross on the door. There was no watchman at the lane's end. The shutters of the upper story were closed, but the shutters of the parlour windows on the ground floor were open, and a single candle was burning on the sill of the parlour window, in the small signal that householders used at night to indicate that they were expecting a particular visitor, and that the household was awake to receive him. Dr. Finch tapped the iron crown of his staff on the green door very softly. The door was opened almost at once by an older woman in a black dress and a white cap, who had the bearing of a housekeeper of long service and the careful expression of a person who had been awake for many hours and was likely to be awake for many hours more. She did not greet him. She did not introduce herself. She stepped back from the door, and she gestured silently with her left hand for Dr. Finch to come in, and she closed the door behind him as soon as he was inside, and she locked it with a heavy iron key that she carried on a ring at her belt. The hallway of the house smelled of beeswax and lavender water, and very faintly, beneath those things, of the smell that Dr. Finch had come to recognize even through the herbs in the beak of his mask, which was the smell of a house in which somebody upstairs was beginning to die of the plague. The housekeeper led him along the hallway in silence, and up a narrow wooden staircase that turned twice as it rose to the upper story, and along an upper hallway hung with small framed pictures of saints and family ancestors, and she stopped at the door of a chamber at the far end of the upper hallway, and she rested her hand on the door for a moment without opening it, and she turned and looked at Dr. Finch with an expression that he did not at first know how to read. She was, he saw, a woman of perhaps 60 years of age, with grey hair tucked carefully beneath the white cap, and a face that was lined in the way that the faces of women who had served long in respectable households were sometimes lined, with the deep small lines around the mouth that came from many years of saying nothing about what one had seen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, in a way that suggested she had been weeping at some point earlier in the evening, but she was not weeping now. She was looking at Dr. Finch with the steady, careful attention of a person who had a thing to say and was choosing her words. "Dr. Finch," she said in a low voice, "before you go in, I should tell you what is in the chamber." "The patient," Dr. Finch said. "Yes," the housekeeper said. "The patient is in the chamber. Miss Rosamond is in the bed by the window. She has the fever and the swelling, as I told the woman who fetched you. She is mostly asleep. She wakes occasionally. She is not in great pain." "Then what is it that you wish to tell me?" The housekeeper paused, with her hand still on the door, and she looked away from Dr. Finch, down the upper hallway, towards the small candle burning at the head of the stairs. She seemed to be considering, very carefully, how she should phrase the next thing she wanted to say. "There is also somebody else in the chamber," she said. "Beside the patient's bed. The somebody else is sitting in a chair. The somebody else has been sitting in the chair since shortly after Miss Rosamond developed the fever this afternoon. The household has not been able to make the somebody else leave. The household has not, in fact, been entirely certain that the somebody else can be addressed by ordinary means at all. The household sent the woman to fetch you not only to attend to Miss Rosamond, but to ask you, Dr. Finch, whether the somebody else in the chair is something that you, with your experience, have seen before in the houses of the dying, and whether you can advise the household on what should be done." Dr. Finch stood in the upper hallway, with his staff in his right hand and his small black bag in his left, and he considered the housekeeper. He had been a physician for 23 years. He had attended deathbeds in the city of London, and in the country houses of his patients in Hertfordshire and Surrey, and in the great wooden ship of the line on which he had served as a junior surgeon in his second year out of Padua, before he had decided that the physician's life suited him better than the surgeon's. He had heard a great many strange things from a great many housekeepers and family members and patients in the long course of his career. He had heard that the late grandmother of a household had been sitting at the foot of a sick bed for 3 days and 3 nights and could not be persuaded to leave. He had heard that an angel had been seen at the bedside of a particular dying child, and that the family wished to know whether the angel's presence indicated that the child would recover or that the child would not. He had heard, in his 4th year of practice, the testimony of a young widow who had reported very calmly to him over tea that the spirit of her late husband had been visiting her bedchamber every night for a month, and that he wished her to send word to his sister in Lincolnshire that the old grey horse was to be given to the gardener. Dr. Finch had developed, over many years, a particular bedside manner for receiving such reports. The manner consisted chiefly of nodding, and of asking quiet, careful questions, and of ascribing the visions, in his own private notes after the visit, to grief and to fever and to the natural workings of the human mind under conditions of great strain. He prepared, in the upper hallway of the house on 3 Crow Lane, to apply the same manner to whatever the housekeeper was about to describe to him. "Tell me," he said, in the gentle voice he kept for such conversations, "what the somebody else looks like." The housekeeper turned her face back to him. "That," she said, "is the difficulty, Dr. Finch. The somebody else in the chair does not look like anything in particular. It is a shape in the chair. The shape is roughly the size of a tall, thin person. The shape is dressed, as far as one can tell, in robes of a very dark color. The shape has no face, or more precisely, the shape has a head, and the head is positioned where a face would be, and the head appears to be looking at Miss Rosamond in the bed, but where the face would be there is only a deeper darkness, of a sort that the candles in the chamber do not seem able to reach into. The shape has been sitting in the chair, perfectly still, for the better part of 9 hours. It has not spoken. It has not moved. It has not made any sign that it is aware of the household. The mistress of the house can see it when she goes into the chamber. The master of the house can see it. The cook saw it when she brought up the broth and dropped the bowl on the threshold and refused to enter the chamber afterwards. I can see it. We can all see it, Dr. Finch, and we have been able to see it since shortly after Miss Rosamond first complained of the headache this afternoon, and the household is asking you, with all respect for your profession, to come into the chamber and tell us what we are seeing." Dr. Finch did not, for a long moment, reply. He stood in the upper hallway, with the small candle burning at the head of the stairs behind him, and he listened very carefully to what the housekeeper had said, and he tried to fit it into the categories of his experience. He could not. The categories he had developed over 23 years of practice were broad, and they covered a great variety of strange reports from grieving and frightened households. They did not cover what the housekeeper had just described. The housekeeper had not described a vision. She had described a thing that several different members of the household were seeing simultaneously, and that had been present in the same chair for 9 hours, and that was not in any way responsive to the household's attempts to address it. That was not a vision. Visions were private events. They were the productions of single minds under particular pressures. Several minds did not produce the same vision in the same chair for 9 hours, and then drop a bowl of broth on the threshold when they encountered it. Dr. Finch was a careful man, and he did not allow his thoughts to run ahead of his evidence. "Has the patient seen it?" he said. "We do not know," the housekeeper said. "Miss Rosamond has been mostly asleep since the fever began. She has not remarked on anything in the chamber. When she wakes, she asks for water, and she asks for her mother, and she has asked twice for the kitten that lives in the scullery. She has not asked about the shape in the chair. We do not know whether she is unable to see it, or whether she is able to see it but does not consider it remarkable, or whether she has seen it and has chosen not to mention it. She is a thoughtful child, Dr. Finch. She has been known to keep her counsel when she has thought it best." "And the shape," he said, "has it harmed anybody?" "No," the housekeeper said. "The shape has done nothing. That is the difficulty. If it had done something, we would know what to do. It has only sat in the chair. It has watched the patient. It has not moved, and it has not spoken, and we do not know what it intends, and we are very afraid, Dr. Finch, of what it might intend, and we are asking you, please, to come and look." Dr. Finch stood in the upper hallway for one more long moment. He considered, briefly, the possibility of turning around and walking back down the narrow stair, and out of the house, and down 3 Crow Lane to his lodgings in Holborn, and locking his door behind him, and not speaking to anybody about what he had heard tonight. He considered also the possibility that he was being made the subject of some elaborate joke by some bored member of a wealthy household, and that he would step into the chamber and find the shape in the chair to be a stuffed thing of black cloth that the household had arranged at the bedside as a prank on the parish doctor. He did not believe the second possibility. The housekeeper's face was not the face of a woman participating in a joke. It was the face of a woman who had been frightened for 9 hours, and who had been holding herself together for the sake of the household, and who was now asking another professional to come and share the weight of what she had been seeing. He took a breath through the long beak of the mask, and he tasted the dried herbs and the vinegar, and he reminded himself that he was a physician, and that he had agreed to attend the patient, and that the duty of the physician was to attend the patient regardless of what else might be in the room. "Open the door," he said. The housekeeper opened the door, and Dr. Finch stepped past her into the chamber. The chamber was a child's bedchamber, in the way that the bedchambers of the daughters of respectable London households were ordinarily furnished. There was a bed beneath the window, with a coverlet of pale blue embroidered with small white flowers. There was a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, with a doll's house arranged on top of it. There was a small writing desk by the wall, with an unfinished letter and an inkwell and a worn book of Common Prayer. There were 2 candles burning on the writing desk, and a third on the windowsill, and a fourth on a small table beside the bed. In the bed, beneath the pale blue coverlet, there was a small girl with fair hair plaited over one shoulder, lying very still on her back with her eyes closed, breathing in the shallow, rapid breaths of the early plague fever. Beside the bed, in a high-backed wooden chair that had been turned to face the patient, there was a tall, thin shape that was dressed in robes of a color the candles in the chamber did not seem able to penetrate, and that had a head in the shape of a head, and that had no face, and that was sitting perfectly still, with what would have been its hands, if it had hands, folded in what would have been its lap, if it had a lap, and that was watching the small girl in the bed, with an attention that Dr. Finch could feel in the chamber, even though he could not see any eyes with which the attention was being given. The shape did not turn its head when Dr. Finch entered. It did not acknowledge him in any way. It continued to watch the small girl in the bed. Dr. Finch stood very still in the doorway of the chamber for a long moment, with his staff in his right hand and his small black bag in his left. And he understood, with a part of his mind that was not yet ready to admit it to the rest of his mind, that the College of Physicians had not, in any of its lectures or textbooks or printed handbooks of plague medicine, prepared him for the present moment. He set his bag on the floor beside the door. He did not set down the staff. He kept the iron crown in his right hand, as the College of Physicians had taught him, although the College of Physicians had taught him to keep the staff for the purposes of examining patients without touching them, and he understood that this was no longer the only purpose for which he might want it. He took 2 careful steps into the chamber. The shape in the chair did not turn. He took 2 more steps and stood at the foot of the bed, with the patient between him and the shape, and from this position he was able to see the patient more clearly, and he was able to see the shape more clearly, and he understood, looking at both, that he had been right about what he had been called to attend. The girl in the bed had the plague. He could see the small dark stain at the side of her neck, where the lymph swelling had begun to bruise the skin. He could see the bluish tinge at her lips that came on in the 2nd day of the fever, when the body began to run short of the breath it could draw. He could see the thin sheen of the sweat on her forehead, and the way her small fingers, lying on the coverlet, were beginning to curl in towards the palms of her hands in the involuntary tightening that he had seen in many other plague patients in the previous 19 days. She would, in his judgment, be dead by morning. There was nothing in his bag that would change that. He had known this before he had stepped into the chamber, and he had stepped into the chamber anyway, because the duty of the physician was to attend the patient. The shape in the chair was not a thing he had prepared his judgment for. He stood at the foot of the bed, and he looked at the shape, and he tried to apply to it the careful observation of the physician in the absence of any other framework that would help him. The shape was approximately the height of a tall, thin man. The robes were of a color that did not have a name. They were not black. Dr. Finch had seen many black things in 19 days of plague work, and he knew the look of black cloth in candlelight, and the robes of the shape were not that. The robes were the color of the place inside a closed cupboard at midnight, when no one has lit a lamp. The color of a shut eye. The color, he thought, with a small sudden clarity, of the inside of a chest of drawers in a room where someone has just died, after the family has left and the candles have been extinguished and the door has been pulled to. That was the color of the robes. The head of the shape was held very still, at a slight angle, in the posture of a creature that was listening to the breathing of the small girl in the bed with the attention of a thing that did not wish to miss anything. Dr. Finch took a long, careful breath through the beak of the mask. He spoke. "I beg your pardon," he said, in the formal voice that he kept for the most difficult interviews of his profession. "I am Dr. Aldous Finch, of the College of Physicians, attending in the parish service. I have been sent to examine the patient in this bed. I would be obliged if you would tell me, sir or madam, by what authority you have come to this chamber, and what your business is with the child." The shape in the chair did not move. Dr. Finch waited. He was patient by his profession, with patients who could not at first answer his questions. He waited longer than he might have waited with a living interlocutor. He counted in his head to 30. The shape did not move. He spoke again. "I am the physician of the parish," he said more firmly. "By the laws of the realm and the customs of the college, I have the authority to examine and to treat the patient in this house. I am asking you, sir, or madam, to identify yourself." The shape did not move. The girl in the bed continued to breathe in the shallow, rapid breaths of the fever. The candles continued to burn. The faint smell of the plague continued to seep into the chamber from the bed and to mingle with the dried herbs in the beak of the mask. Dr. Finch took another breath, and he tried, for the third time, with what he hoped was a different approach. "I see that you are not inclined to speak," he said. "Very well. I will continue with my examination of the patient. I would ask only that you do not interfere. I will move closer to the bed in order to take the patient's pulse, if you would be so good as to permit me to do so." He waited again. The shape did not move. He took this as the only consent he was likely to receive, and he stepped around the foot of the bed, slowly, on the side of the bed away from the chair, and he came up to the patient on her left side, where the bed was set against the wall. He set the staff against the wall beside the bed. He took the small girl's left hand, very gently, in his own gloved fingers, and he found the pulse at her wrist, and he counted the pulse for a full minute by the small clock that was ticking on the writing desk across the chamber. The pulse was rapid and thready, in the way that all his plague patients' pulses had been rapid and thready in the second day of the illness. The pulse confirmed what he had already known. The girl would not survive the night. He held her hand for a moment longer than the medical examination required. He wished, as he sometimes wished with his patients, that he were a different sort of man, a man who could pray in the way the priests prayed, and ask for an intercession that he was not entirely certain would come from any quarter that recognized the request. He was not that man. He was a physician of the college, trained at Padua. He had long ago given up the idea that prayer of his sort would be heard at the right address. He held the small girl's hand in the absence of prayer, and he tried to communicate to her by the small pressure of his fingers that he was sorry he had not got to her sooner, and that he was sorry he could not do more, and that he was watching with her, and that she would not be alone. He was watching with her. He was not, he realized, the only one. He looked up very slowly from the patient's hand, and he looked across the bed at the shape in the chair. The shape had not moved, but the head was now tilted very slightly in his direction, in a small adjustment that had not been there a moment before. The shape was watching him, watching the patient. Dr. Finch held the gaze, for what was not a gaze in the strict sense, since the shape had no eyes that he could see. He held what would have been the gaze with what would have been his own gaze, and after several seconds the shape spoke for the first time. The voice did not come from the shape, exactly. It came from the chamber. It came from all four corners of the chamber at once, in a soft tone that was not loud and was not quiet, but was the tone that words have when they are being said inside the listener's own head, in the listener's own thinking voice, and the listener is suddenly not certain whether the words are being said by themselves or by something else. "I will not speak the patient's name," the voice said. It would not be courteous. Dr. Finch held very still, with the small girl's hand still in his. "Whose courtesy do you serve?" he said, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper. "I serve no household," the voice said. "I am not a servant in that sense. I am a witness. I have sat with this patient since shortly after the fever began. I will sit with her until shortly after the fever ends. I am here for the duration. I am not here to interfere. I am not here to harm. I am here because she should not be alone in this. I am here because someone should be watching, and the household is afraid to come close, and the kitten in the scullery cannot come up the stairs, and the parish doctor has not yet arrived. The parish doctor, the voice noted, with what might almost have been described as a small private warmth, has now arrived. Dr. Finch swallowed behind the mask. "You are a witness," he said, "to her death." "To her dying," the voice said. "There is a small but important difference. Death is the event. Dying is the work. The work is sometimes long and is always lonely, and there ought to be a witness for the work when the family is afraid and the parish is overwhelmed and the kitten cannot climb the stairs. I am the witness for the work. I do not know who appoints me. I do not know what I am in the strict sense. I have been doing this for a great many years, in a great many cities, in a great many bedchambers. The patient in this bed will be the 71,000th witnessing of my long employment. I sit, I watch. I do not interfere. When the work is done, I leave. That is all that I do. That is all that I am." Dr. Finch was silent. He thought, in his physician's way, about all the deathbeds he had attended in 23 years of practice. He thought about the faces of the dying, as they had watched something across the room that the family had not been able to see, and that he had ascribed, in his careful private notes, to the small fevers of the failing brain. He thought about how often the dying had seemed, in their last hours, to be having a quiet conversation with somebody present in the chamber whom no one else could see, and how he had taken this as the ordinary phenomenon of the failing senses, and had made no further note of it. He thought about all the bedsides at which he had sat, in all the long years, where it had seemed to him that the dying had been not entirely alone with him, and he had not asked who else was there, because he had not believed there was anyone to ask. "How many of my patients," he said slowly, "have you attended?" "I do not count by physicians," the voice said. "I do not assign witnessings to particular doctors, but there have been many that you and I have shared, Dr. Finch. The old shoemaker on Long Acre last August, the young wife who died in childbed in the great house at Bloomsbury in the spring of the year before, the widower with the 3 sons, in the small house in Drury Lane, who died of the dropsy in the winter of 1663. I sat with all of them. You were a great kindness to them in those last hours. They thought well of you, all of them, and the old shoemaker in particular asked me to thank you for the lozenges, which had eased his throat, and which he had not had the breath to thank you for himself before the work was done." Dr. Finch closed his eyes for a long moment behind the mask. He had not, until that moment in the chamber on 3 Crow Lane, ever been thanked for the lozenges by the old shoemaker on Long Acre. The shoemaker had died on a Thursday morning in the August of the year before, with his daughter holding his hand, and he had not spoken in his last hour, and Dr. Finch had marked him in his book and had moved on to the next call. He had liked the old shoemaker. He had thought about him, sometimes in the long evenings after his work. "I thank you for the message," he said quietly. "It is kindly given and kindly received." The shape in the chair inclined its head very slightly, in a small bow that was so courteous and so familiar in its formality that Dr. Finch felt for a moment as though he were addressing a colleague at the college. "May I ask you a question?" he said. "You may," said the voice. "The patient, the girl, is there nothing that can be done?" "There is nothing that can be done in the medical sense," the voice said. "The plague has settled in her too quickly. You knew this when you took her pulse. You are not a man who deceives himself in such things, Dr. Finch, and I do not deceive you now. Then what should I do?" "Sit," said the voice very gently. "Sit with her. The work will not be long. She is a thoughtful child, and she has seen me in the chair, although she has not remarked on me. She knows that someone is watching, and she has been comforted by it in a quiet way. She will be more comforted if there are 2 of us. The household cannot come close, and the household should not come close. The kitten in the scullery cannot come up the stairs. You are the parish doctor. You are the only one who can sit at her bedside and not be sealed in for 40 days afterwards. Sit, Dr. Finch. Do the work with me. That is the answer to your question." Dr. Finch sat. There was a small wooden stool beside the bed, on the wall side, that he had not noticed when he had first come around. He sat on the stool. He took the small girl's left hand in his own gloved fingers, and he held it. The shape in the high-backed chair on the other side of the bed did not move and did not speak again and did not interfere in any way. The candles burned on the writing desk and on the windowsill and on the small table beside the bed. The clock on the writing desk ticked. The girl breathed in the shallow, rapid breaths of the fever, and sometimes, in her sleep, she made small, soft sounds. And once, in the deepest part of the night, she opened her eyes briefly and looked at Dr. Finch on his stool and looked across the bed at the shape in the chair and smiled a very small smile and closed her eyes again. She died at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning by the clock on the writing desk. Dr. Finch held her hand for a long while after the last breath. The shape in the chair held its position and watched and did not move. When Dr. Finch finally laid the small hand back on the coverlet and folded the other hand on top of it in the formal way he had folded the hands of many patients in 19 days of work, the shape in the chair stood. It stood without using its hands and without unfolding its legs in any natural way. It simply was standing where a moment before it had been sitting. It bowed very slightly in the formal courtesy with which it had bowed before, and it spoke for the last time. "Thank you, Dr. Finch," the voice said. "The work has been done well. I will go now to the next bedside. There are a great many beds in London tonight. I am sorry that you and I will likely meet again in this season. I am not sorry that we have met. The patient was not alone. That was the answer to the question of this night. I will keep that with me in the long employment, and I hope you will too." And then the shape was no longer in the chamber. It did not walk to the door. It did not vanish in any dramatic fashion. It simply was no longer there. The high-backed chair stood empty, with its back to the window, in the same position it had occupied for the long hours of the night. Dr. Finch sat on the stool for some time after the shape had gone. The light at the window had begun, very slowly, to take on the first grey of dawn. He stood, eventually, and he gathered his bag, and he took up his staff, and he went down the narrow staircase to the parlour, where the master and mistress of the house were waiting for him in the small grey light of morning, with cups of tea grown cold on the table between them. And he told them, in the careful voice of his profession, that their daughter had died, and that he was very sorry, and that the household must now send word to the parish, so that the cross could be painted on the door and the proper measures could be taken. He did not tell them about the shape in the chair. He thought, for a long time afterwards, about whether he should have told them. He concluded, in the end, that the shape had not been theirs to know about, and that the comfort the shape had been offering had been offered to the patient and not to the household, and that it would have been a kind of betrayal of the night to describe it. The household had not seen what he had seen. The household had seen only a still figure that had frightened them. The thing he had seen was not the thing they had seen, and it was not his to translate. He walked home to Holborn through the early light, in the cool morning air after the rain of the night before, with the long beak of the mask lowered, and the wide brim of the hat pulled forward against the small east wind that always rose at dawn in the city in summer. He attended the rounds of the parish for the rest of the season, until the cold weather came in October, and the bills of mortality began at last to fall, and the city began the long, slow work of becoming itself again. He never saw the shape in the chair again, in any chamber he attended, with any patient, in any house, for the rest of his career. He did not know whether the shape had decided, after the night on 3 Crow Lane, that he no longer required to see it, or whether the shape was always present at his bedsides, and he had simply lost the small permission of perception that had been granted to him for one night and never granted again, or whether, perhaps, he had imagined the whole thing, and the housekeeper of the house with the green door had imagined it with him, and the plague had distorted both of their minds in the same way at the same time, by some mechanism that the College of Physicians had not yet discovered. He preferred, in the end, the second explanation. It was the kindest of the three. It allowed him to believe that the small girl on 3 Crow Lane had not died alone, and that the old shoemaker on Long Acre had not died alone, and that the young wife in the great house at Bloomsbury had not died alone, and that the widower in Drury Lane had not died alone, and that none of the patients he had ever sat with had ever been alone, in the strict sense, even when he had not been able to sit with them himself, and even when their families had been afraid to come close, and even when the kittens of their houses could not come up the stairs. He continued in his practice for another 28 years. He attended a great many more deathbeds in many parishes of the city, and in the country houses of his patients in Hertfordshire and Surrey, and in the small lodgings of poor families in the long lanes of St. Giles and Spitalfields and Wapping. He sat with all of them. He held their hands when they wished it. He did not pray with them, because that was not the kind of physician he had been trained to be. But he sat with them, and he watched the work, and he understood, in a way he had not understood before the night on 3 Crow Lane, that the watching was the work, and that the work was a good work, and that someone, somewhere, was always watching the work with him. He died in his bed in Holborn in the spring of 1693, at the age of 68. His wife had died of the smallpox 6 years before. His daughters were grown and married, and had children of their own. His apprentice Thomas, who had become a physician in his own right, and had taken over the Holborn practice some years previous, was at his bedside in the last hours, with a cup of warm wine and a damp cloth, and the small black bag of instruments that Dr. Finch had given him on the day of his graduation, which had been the same bag that Dr. Finch's father had given him on the day of his own graduation, in the year 1642. Dr. Finch died at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning by the small clock on his writing desk. He had not, since the night on 3 Crow Lane, ever seen the shape in the chair again. But he saw it, very briefly, in the corner of his bedchamber, in the deep shadow beside the wardrobe where the candlelight did not quite reach, in the last hour of his life. The shape did not move. It did not speak. It only inclined its head very slightly, in the small courteous bow with which it had bowed twice before, in the chamber on 3 Crow Lane, in the August of 1665, in the long, hot summer of the plague. Dr. Finch smiled, behind the small grey beard he had grown in his later years, and he closed his eyes, and he was not afraid. The work was the work. There was a witness for it. He had always suspected that there was.